The Treaty of Waitangi has been described as the founding document in New Zealand history. It was signed on the 6th of February 1840, and the signing included 500 Māori chiefs, 13 of those being women. It was signed giving the British governorship and control over New Zealand, and it was to be ruled under the British Crown. The document was meant to solidify the Māori and Europeans together in an unbreakable bond. However, it created the most controversial events known to New Zealand's history. There were negative consequences after the treaty, which in my opinion were as a result of it. The consequences occurred because of the problems of the translation. There were two treaties created, one in English and one in Māori. However, there were significant problems with this. For example, there were obvious language barriers and different ideas over resources such as land, which made it impossible for Governor William Hobson to write a treaty supporting both Māori and British needs evenly. The negative consequences that swiftly followed the signing of the treaty was the Northern War, part of a series of 7 battles between 1845 and 1872, known as the New Zealand Wars. The photo you are viewing now is from the website treatyofwaitangi.net.nz. The problem with this is meant to be a photo of a real life photo of the treaty itself. The problem with this source is that it is hard to know whether it is actually the Treaty of Waitangi. There are no real indicators on the photo that it is the treaty. We have to trust the photo, which is always risky, especially when you have to question the reliability of the source. Causes of the event. There were many causes of why the treaty was created, both from European and Māori perspectives. For example, the Māori were intrigued by the idea of becoming a colony of Britain, as they sought protection from other nations such as France, who had a growing interest in New Zealand. The Māori went to great lengths to be protected by the British. For example, they had previously signed a document entitled the Declaration of Independence, which was signed in 1835. However, this was not received well by the Colonial Office, therefore it was appropriate that another document should be made. In 1831, 13 Māori chiefs had also sent a letter to King William V seeking protection from the French. The first part of the letter to King William V reads, "We the chiefs of New Zealand assembled at this place, called the Kerikeri, write to thee, for we hear that thou art the great chief of the other side of the water, since the many ships which come to our land are from thee." The French previously had sent a naval vessel to New Zealand, which showed their interest in the country. In 1838, Frenchman Jean-François Lavorde asked the French king to set up a colony in Akaroa, as he saw the money-making potential in the town. The Māori did not necessarily trust the British rule, however they saw them as a more trustworthy ally than the French. Other reasons for the treaty being signed was because in Kororareka, nowadays known as Russell, British sailors who had spent months at sea would stay in Kororareka to consume alcohol as well as sleep with prostitutes. There was a large amount of crime occurring in the town, with the drunken sailors starting brawls and raping women. It soon quickly gained its name in the Pacific as the Hellhole of the Pacific. The Māori refused to tolerate this. However, they were not prepared to intervene, as they saw it as the responsibility of the British to act on it. This meant the British had to act on this and create order and control in Kororareka, and one of the ways they went about this was presenting a treaty. From the British point of view, the population of settlers had significantly increased. Trade had also skyrocketed, particularly Māori and muskets, which they traded flax and other various foods to the British for. Because of this trade, it improved relations between the Māori and British, which meant the Māori were more willing to sign the treaty, as trading with the British was now an essential part of the Māori lifestyle. For example, by 1830, every tribe in the North Island owned muskets, either because they wanted to have a technological advantage over their enemy, or because they simply needed them to defend themselves. Muskets proved immensely fatal, as musket wars occurred in the early 1800s and was said to have killed over 20,000 people, as Ngāpuhi attacked tribes in the southern areas of the North Island. The trade between the British and the Māori was very important for the Māori. They no longer could function in day-to-day life without some form of trade from the British. Consequences of the event. The Treaty of Waitangi, although there is historical value and significance to Britain and Māori, there were severe consequences as a result of the document, which still affect modern New Zealand. The first trigger point, in my opinion, which sparked the initial conflict over the treaty, was the false understanding of the governorship over New Zealand. For example, when the Māori signed the treaty, they thought this meant that they would still govern their own people, and the British would look after the British. This was because the number of British settlers had increased so rapidly they had almost equalled with the entire Māori population, and the Māori wanted the British to control the British. Secondly, there were communication errors throughout the writing of the treaty. This was due to the fact that two copies had to be made, one in English and one in Māori. The English to Māori was very difficult, as the Māori had different ideals about what parts of the treaty meant. For example, the Māori thought that the land ownership meant that they would always spiritually own the land and could take it back whenever they chose. However, the British simply saw the land as a buy and sell type of trade. Governor William Hobson, who wrote the treaty, struggled, rightly so, to translate effectively enough the English to Māori. Arguably, the most significant part, the consequence of the Treaty of Waitangi, was the Northern War, which began in 1845 and concluded in 1846. The war occurred because of the complications within the treaty, mainly in regards to the Europeans confiscating the land of the Māori. Not all the Māori were against the British, however. For example, the Ngāpuhi tribe, which consisted of much of the North Island, was separated into two factions. Hone Heke led the resistance against the British, as he felt that there was an injustice with the British rule, and demanded all land confiscated from the Māori to be returned. The other faction of the Ngāpuhi tribe was known as the pro-government faction, which saw the benefits of trade with the British as too much of a positive to cause conflict over. The Northern War was a bloody massacre fought with innovative ideas, particularly used by the Māori. Māori suffered slightly more casualties than the British, with 94 Māori killed compared with the 82 casualties suffered by the British. Overall, from 1845 to 1872, there were 7 wars and stand labelled under the title the New Zealand Wars. The Northern War was included in these wars. These wars resulted from the Treaty of Waitangi, and still land allocation could not be agreed between the Māori and the British. There were other complications with the treaty, such as the introduction of the Māori King in 1858, which sparked huge controversy as the Māori wanted their own governing representative. However, the British saw this as an opposition to their monarch. The first Māori king's name was Te Wherowhero. However, it was the second Māori king that sparked most conflict. For example, the source you are viewing now was gathered from tiara.government. This is the painting of King Te Whaiau, who was the second Māori king. Although it is useful because it gives a physical description of what he would have looked like and also shows him in the light of a Māori warrior as he is holding a patu, a limitation of the source is the fact that it does not tell us much about who he was or the specific things he did, simply because it is a picture. However, the source still lacks usefulness. This controversy soon caused war on the Waikato, as Te Whaiau, the king, in 1860 led a resistance movement taking back land from the British they believed was rightfully theirs. The Waikato Wars, also known as the Land Wars, lasted from 1863 to 1864. All the consequences discussed today have all stemmed from the Treaty of Waitangi. After the document was finalised, there was an obvious imbalance of power and standard of living. The Māori were exploited as they were seen as less of a being than the British. The Māori were not used to sharing the nation with another ethnicity, let alone being pushed aside and viewed as second rate. The language barrier also complicated the treaty. For example, the fundamental ideals of things like land was completely different for the Māori and the British. So not only translating from Māori to English was near impossible, it made the job essentially impossible with these underlying fundamentals. Overall, conflict was destined, and the Treaty of Waitangi was the catalyst. Significance to New Zealanders. The Treaty of Waitangi was arguably the most significant piece of history to New Zealanders. It's the perfect example of showing the start of two ethnicities sharing the same country, which is a major piece of history for every New Zealander living to this day. It is also hugely significant in the negative sense, as it sparked huge controversy. For example, as briefly touched on, over what was known as the New Zealand Wars, which started in 1845 with the Northern War and concluded in 1872 with Te Kui's War. There were 7 battles in the New Zealand Wars, and they were all somewhat dependent of each other. For example, often the battles led into the next battle. Over the 28 years of war, there were supposedly 2,154 Māori killed and 754 British killed. This death toll was extremely significant to New Zealanders for not only the fact that it's simply death, and it also affects many people. However, but also for that fact, it darkens New Zealand's history. A problem with these statistics is the fact that there are no real primary documentations of the battles that occurred in New Zealand wars. The New Zealand wars are not a significant event in relation to the world, therefore the information about specific detail regarding the wars are very limited. Therefore, I cannot completely trust the statistics are given, simply because I cannot cross-reference it with anything. Most people living in New Zealand are from European descent. Hearing about the consequences that arose from the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, such as the New Zealand Wars, paints the Europeans in a dark light. This is significant to us because we must know that a lot of these people who confiscated the land off the Māori and fought against the Māori resistance were our ancestors. They committed a lot of unforgivable acts against the Māori. The treaty still affects people in modern times. For example, Māori still seek land that was illegally taken off them, and as a result of the Treaty of Waitangi. It has been a major talking point since 1975. One of the very first major payouts from the government to the Māori occurred in 1995, when the Māori from the Waikato demanded a payout for the land confiscated that occurred and as a result of the Treaty of Waitangi. $170 million was paid and a formal apology from Queen Elizabeth II on her visit to New Zealand in 1995. There have been around 34 treaty claims and settlements that have occurred since 1992 and up until 2015. As of 2008, the total payout for the government to the Pacific Māori tribes was $952 million. The largest claim coming from Ngā Tahu, which have around 40,000 people in the tribe, and the area they occupy stretches from the top of the North Island all the way to the upper region of the south. Their claim was for $170 million. In my opinion, this shows that the British were in the wrong in some ways these huge payouts are a pain in the Māori. However, the huge consequences of the signing of the treaty are pure evidence that the British were the wrong and had the intent to manipulate and trick the Māori to a certain degree. What this also showed was the failure of the treaty. The treaty was meant to create this unbreakable bond between the Māori and the British and unite them under one monarch. Given these events such as the New Zealand Wars and the Māori King introduced in 1858, I would say there is enough evidence to suggest that the treaty can be seen as a failure. Even in modern times when people in New Zealand hear about the Treaty of Waitangi, it is not met with positive thoughts, as there is a general conception throughout New Zealand that the British unlawfully took land off the Māori. Whether that is true or not is completely up to the individual. However, considering this as the main perception and thought amongst a significant amount of New Zealanders, I would say this indicates a failure in the treaty.